A forbidden name erased itself from every Tevalan bloodline the moment a terrified human refused to speak it. Now every faction in the galaxy wants to know how someone so afraid of people managed to break a 5-century chain. Tell me where you're watching from, subscribe to join this strange little community, and let's begin the story. The basement of the Institute for Interspecies Studies smelled like old circuits and recycled air. Daniel Moretti preferred it that way. Down here, 3 levels below the conference rooms where actual important people did actual important things, nobody bothered him. Just him, his scratched smart glasses, and the hum of servers that had been cataloging alien data since before he was born. Athena 9's voice cut through the quiet. Reminder: Dr. Chen requires your attendance at the guest lecture in 47 minutes. Dan's fingers froze over the holographic display. No. Absolutely not. Tell her I'm sick. I cannot lie to authorized personnel. Also, you used that excuse last month. Food poisoning? Twice last month. Dan slouched deeper into his chair, the kind of posture his mother would have smacked him for. At 31, he'd perfected the art of occupying the smallest possible space in any room. Thin, slightly hunched, perpetually rumpled, he looked like someone who'd rather dissolve into furniture than be noticed. Athena, if I die of embarrassment at this lecture, delete my search history. Your search history consists primarily of linguistic databases and coffee shop reviews. Neither are particularly embarrassing. It's the principle of the thing. The truth was, Dan was excellent at his job. Give him an untranslated alien text, a few thousand hours, and complete silence, and he'd crack it. He'd deciphered 7 previously unknown dialects in 3 years. The problem started when anyone asked him to explain how. His tablet pinged. The Sonda recording again. The ancient Tevalan probe that had crashed in the Pacific decades before official first contact. Most researchers had given up on it, dismissed it as corrupted data. But Dan kept seeing patterns in the noise, like a melody hidden under static. Especially that one symbol. The curved glyph that appeared 17 times in the recording, always with the same tonal frequency, always accompanied by what his pattern recognition software flagged as ceremonial syntax. 45 minutes, Athena reminded him. Dan sighed and pulled up the lecture announcement. Dr. Lysa Areth, visiting scholar from Tevalan Prime. Topic: Lost memories of first contact. His stomach nodded. A room full of people. A famous speaker, the expectation to look engaged and not like he was planning 17 different escape routes. But that symbol, if anyone would know what it meant, it would be her. He grabbed his tablet and jacket. Fine, but I'm sitting in the back. A novel strategy, Athena said dryly. The lecture hall was already half full when Dan slipped in, choosing a seat in the last row, corner position, next to the emergency exit. Perfect. He could observe, take notes, and vanish the moment it ended. Dr. Areth entered from the side door, and Dan understood immediately why people called her elegant. Tall, even by Tevalan standards, with that characteristic olive-toned skin that seemed to catch light differently than human skin did. Her dark hair was pulled into an immaculate knot, and her formal attire, all dark fabric with subtle metallic threading, looked like it had never experienced a wrinkle. She moved like someone who'd never doubted her right to be in a room. Dan sank lower in his seat and started chewing on his stylus cap. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Areth began, her voice carrying the precise, almost musical cadence of educated Tevalan. Today, I wish to share discoveries from our archaeological missions to the outer reaches, where we found evidence of contact between Tevalan and other species long before the Galactic Council existed. The presentation was fascinating. Dan forgot to be anxious for almost 10 minutes, caught up in images of ancient structures and fragments of treaties written in 3 different alien languages. Then she displayed a slide of Tevalan glyphs, and Dan's heart stopped. There, 3rd row, far right corner, the exact symbol from his recording, the one he'd been obsessing over for 6 months. But here, It was part of a larger sequence, surrounded by other markings he didn't recognize. His hand moved before his brain caught up, jotting notes frantically. The position in the sequence, the surrounding context, the way Dr. Aerith moved past it without comment, as if it were merely decorative. "Questions?" she asked at the end. Dan's hand definitely did not raise. He waited for the crowd to disperse, then practically ran back to his basement sanctuary. The symbol burned into his mind. "Athena, pull up the Sonda recording. Focus on timestamps where our target glyph appears. Resuming your obsession with ancient Tevalan archaeology? It's not an obsession, it's research. The line between those is often blurry." Dan barely heard her, because now, with the context from the lecture, he could see what he'd been missing. The symbol wasn't isolated. It was always part of a phrase structure, and if he mapped the phonetic patterns Athena had been tracking. "This might actually be solvable," he whispered. Famous last words, Athena replied. But Dan was already deep in the data, the lecture forgotten, the anxiety temporarily quieted. He had a puzzle to solve, and puzzles didn't judge you for stumbling over words or forgetting how to make eye contact. He just had no idea that this particular puzzle was about to judge him in ways he couldn't imagine. For 3 days, Dan lived in the laboratory. Coffee replaced sleep. The Sonda recording played on loop, each repetition revealing new layers. Athena's algorithms worked overtime, cross-referencing every linguistic database in the Institute's archives. Phonetic reconstruction, 73% complete. Athena announced at 2 a.m. on the third night. The target sequence appears to follow ceremonial speech patterns consistent with pre-unification Tevalan. Dan rubbed his eyes behind his glasses. Pre-unification. That was over 500 years ago, before the Tevalan civil wars ended and the current council system emerged. Most records from that era had been deliberately destroyed or sealed. Why would something that old be on a probe that crashed here 70 years ago? Insufficient data to hypothesize. However, I detect something unusual. This phrase appears in 47 different treaties marked as classified by the Tevalan archives. All of them were sealed after the unification wars. Dan sat up straighter. 47 classified treaties. That wasn't academic curiosity, that was historical suppression. Through the lab's small window, he could see the main building. Somewhere in there, Dr. Aerith was probably sleeping in her guest quarters, or maybe reviewing her research, every hair in place, every thought organized. Meanwhile, he looked like he'd been pulled through a recycling vent. The contrast wasn't lost on him. She gave lectures. He hid in basements. She wore formal attire with metallic threading. He wore the same hoodie 3 days running. "Athena, can you isolate the phonetic sequence? Give me the most likely pronunciation?" The AI hummed, processing. "Working. Please note that archaic Tevalan included tonal components that human vocal cords may not accurately reproduce. Do your best." A sound file appeared on his display. Dan listened to it 17 times, trying to wrap his mouth around syllables that felt like they were designed for a different throat. The word had weight to it, each phoneme deliberate and formal. He practiced quietly, alone in the lab feeling ridiculous. "Aretha. No, that's not right. Aretha." His tablet chimed. A message from Dr. Chen. "Morning team meeting 9 a.m. Attendance mandatory. Yes, Dan, that includes you." Dan glanced at the time. 6:47 a.m. He'd worked through another night. His reflection in the darkened monitor showed exactly how rough he looked, but he had something. Maybe not a complete translation, but a thread. And if he could just figure out what this word meant. "Athena, how often does Dr. Aerith use the main library?" Scanning her access logs, she visits daily, typically between 14:00 and 17:00. Should I flag this as stalking behavior? It's not stalking, it's strategic research timing. Those are definitely different things, Athena said, in a tone that suggested they absolutely were not. Dan saw her that afternoon, a glimpse through the library's glass walls. She sat at a research terminal, perfectly upright, reviewing something on a holographic display. Even from a distance, she radiated that same controlled composure from the lecture. He chickened out, walked right past the library entrance, circled the building, and went back to his basement. "Cowardice noted," Athena observed. "Shut up. I am an artificial intelligence. I do not have the capacity to speak, therefore cannot shut what I do not have. You know what I mean." But the recording wouldn't let him rest. That symbol, that word, it meant something. Something important enough to be buried, classified, erased from 47 different historical documents. 2 more days passed. The word became an obsession, a puzzle piece he couldn't fit anywhere. Dan's pronunciation improved, guided by Athena's analysis of tonal frequencies and linguistic patterns. On the 5th day, Athena made a breakthrough. "I have completed the phonetic reconstruction. Confidence level, 87%. The word you are attempting to pronounce is likely Aerithanar." Dan spoke it aloud, carefully forming each syllable. Aerithanar. Nothing happened. The lab didn't explode. Lightning didn't strike. Just silence and the quiet hum of servers. But somewhere in the Institute's network, buried in protocols older than Earth's first satellite, something heard. Something recognized. And something sent a signal that nobody in that basement laboratory noticed. A signal that traveled through ancient, supposedly dormant channels, reaching out across the city, across the planet, and into the void beyond. Athena flagged it 3 seconds later. Unusual network activity detected. The Sonda probe just transmitted something. What? That thing hasn't transmitted in decades. Correction, it has not transmitted anything we could detect. This signal is encrypted using protocols I do not have clearance to decode. Dan stared at his display. "I just said a word. How could that trigger anything?" "Unknown. However, I suggest you document this discovery immediately. Dr. Chen will want to know." But Dan wasn't thinking about Dr. Chen. He was thinking about classified treaties and buried history, and the fact that Dr. Aerith had come all the way to Earth specifically to research pre-contact records. Records that might include the very word he'd just spoken. "Athena, can I request a meeting with Dr. Aerith?" "You can. Whether you will is a separate question." Dan took a deep breath. His hands were shaking, that familiar pre-presentation panic rising in his chest. A meeting meant talking, explaining, being looked at and judged, but he had to know. He had to understand what he'd found. "Schedule it, please." "Appointment request sent. She has responded. She has an opening Thursday at 14 Euro, Research Room 7, 30 minutes. 4 days. He had 4 days to prepare, to rehearse, to figure out how to explain this without sounding insane. 4 days to avoid having a complete anxiety-induced meltdown. "This is a terrible idea," he muttered. "Most of your ideas are terrible," Athena agreed cheerfully. "This one has the distinction of potentially being historically significant as well." Great, Dan thought, just great. Dan rehearsed the meeting 43 times. In the shower, walking to the cafeteria, alone in his quarters at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come. Each time, he imagined a different disaster, forgetting how to speak, accidentally insulting her, dropping his tablet. All 3 simultaneously. "Your anxiety levels are approaching dangerous territory," Athena observed on Wednesday evening. "I am obligated to suggest you speak with medical services." "I'm fine." "You have consumed 7 cups of coffee today and slept approximately 9 hours total this week. Your definition of fine is medically questionable." Dan ignored her, running through his presentation notes again. He'd organized everything. Symbols from the Sonda recording, cross-references with Dr. Aerith's lecture slides, Athena's phonetic analysis, network activity logs showing the transmission that occurred after he spoke the word. It was thorough, professional, completely anxiety-proof, except for the part where he had to actually present it to someone who intimidated the hell out of him. He saw Dr. Aerith twice that week, both times from a safe distance. Once in the cafeteria, sitting alone with a cup of tea and a datapad, reviewing something with that trademark focus. Once in the hallway outside the main conference room, speaking with Dr. Chen in perfect formal English. Both times, Dan had the same thought. She belonged in those spaces, clean, organized, controlled, while he belonged in basements with humming servers and coffee stains on his desk. On Wednesday afternoon, he passed her in the library corridor. She was leaving, he was entering. For one terrible moment, they were 3 feet apart. She inclined her head. "Good afternoon." A polite acknowledgement, standard interspecies courtesy protocol. Dan's brain short-circuited. "Yeah, you. Also, good." She paused, golden eyes meeting his with what might have been curiosity, or might have been polite confusion. Then she continued past him, footsteps precise and measured. "Athena, I just said, yeah, you also good to a renowned scholar." "I heard. I am experiencing second-hand embarrassment, which should not be possible for an artificial intelligence." Dan spent the rest of Wednesday evening convinced he should cancel the meeting. Thursday morning, he was sure of it. By Thursday at 13:45, standing outside Research Room 7, he was actively considering faking his own death. The door was closed. Inside, he could see her through the glass, setting up a holographic display. Perfectly organized, perfectly composed. His hand shook as he reached for the door panel. He could walk away, send an apologetic message, bury the discovery and let someone else figure it out in 50 years. But then he thought about that symbol, about 47 classified treaties, about a word that had been important enough to trigger ancient protocols that nobody else had even noticed. Some mysteries demanded solving, even when they terrified you. Dan pressed the door panel. Dr. Aerith looked up from her work, and for a moment, Dan forgot every word in every language he'd ever studied. "Mr. Moretti, yes?" She gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." The room was too clean, too organized, too full of her presence. Dan's carefully prepared opening statement evaporated. Yes, Dan. Just Dan. Mr. Moretti is my father, and he's... Anyway." "Stop talking," his brain screamed. "Just stop." "I think I found something in the old Sonda recording, the one from before first contact. There's a symbol that matched your lecture slides, and I've been trying to decode it for months but couldn't until I saw your presentation. And then Athena helped with the phonetic reconstruction, and I tested it. And something weird happened with the network. And I know this sounds insane, but I really think it's important, and I probably should have started with that." He ran out of breath and oxygen simultaneously. Dr. Aerith's expression hadn't changed. "You analyzed the crashed probe?" "Yes. I've been analyzing it. For a while. It's kind of my project. Nobody else wanted it." "And you found linguistic patterns?" Dan fumbled with his tablet, nearly dropped it, caught it, then pulled up his organized presentation. "Here. This symbol appears 17 times, always with the same tonal signature, always in what Athena flags as ceremonial syntax. And when I compared it with your lecture slides..." He showed her the correlation, the symbol from the probe, the matching glyph from her presentation, the phonetic reconstruction. Athena suggested this might be a name or title, something formal, so I tested the pronunciation and... He pulled up the network logs. The probe transmitted, first time in decades. Dr. Aerith leaned forward, studying his data. Dan couldn't read her expression. Tevalan faces were almost human, but not quite, and the subtle differences made interpretation nearly impossible for him. "What did you say?" Her voice was very quiet. "The exact pronunciation." Dan's throat went dry. This was it, the moment he'd rehearsed 43 times, and now all he could remember was the sound itself. Athena reconstructed it from the audio patterns. It's probably not perfect because human vocal cords don't do the tonal things quite right, but I tried my best, and the pattern recognition software said I got within acceptable range. Mr. Moretti. Dan. Ayo. She was looking directly at him now, and something in her golden eyes had changed. What did you say? He closed his eyes for a second, took the breath his anxiety therapist had taught him years ago, and spoke the word that had consumed his week. Erethanar. The effect was immediate and total. Dr. Lysa Erith, elegant scholar, renowned expert, the woman who'd given that perfect lecture without a single note, went absolutely pale. Her pupils contracted to pinpoints. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped backward. Then she dropped to her knees. Not collapsed, not fainted. Deliberately, formally knelt before him, head bowed, as if he'd just pronounced judgment or sentence or some terrible sacred thing. Oh God, oh no, I said it wrong. Didn't I? Dan nearly fell out of his own chair trying to reach her. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean... Athena said it might be wrong, but I thought close enough would be okay for research purposes. Where did you hear that name? Her voice shook, completely unlike the controlled precision from the lecture. The Sonda recording. I just told you. The crashed probe. I thought it was academic. I swear I didn't mean any disrespect to anything sacred or... She looked up at him, and Dan realized with absolute horror that her eyes were wet. That is not an academic term. That is the binding name of my house. The name that was sealed and forbidden to be spoken outside ritual. No human should know it. No one should know it. Dan felt the floor tilt. Your... what? You just spoke my family's deepest secret, she whispered. The name we buried, to save ourselves from what we'd done. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Dr. Erith knelt on the floor of Research Room 7, head bowed like she was waiting for execution. Dan sat frozen in his chair, his brain trying and failing to process what had just happened. Then his instincts kicked in. The same instincts that made him terrible at presentations, but decent at being human. He dropped to his knees, too. Please get up, he said. Whatever I did, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. She raised her head, and the shock on her face was almost comical. Why are you kneeling? Because you are, and it feels really wrong to sit in a chair while someone's on the floor because of something I said, even if I don't understand what I said or why it made you... He gestured helplessly. This. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, slowly, she stood. Dan scrambled to his feet, too, nearly tripping over his own shoes. You knelt, she said, as if testing the words, when you could have... Could have what? Enjoyed watching someone have a panic attack because of me? I already feel terrible enough. He ran his hand through his hair, making it stand up at even worse angles. Please tell me what I did wrong so I can fix it, or never do it again, or both. She moved to the chair, but didn't sit. Instead, she gripped the back of it like it was the only thing keeping her upright. You did nothing wrong. That is the problem. How is doing nothing wrong a problem? Because you discovered something that should not exist, and you did it through pure research, with no malicious intent, which makes you... She stopped, seemed to struggle for words. Dangerous in a way my people never anticipated. Dan felt his anxiety spike into new territory. I'm not dangerous. I'm a translator. I hide in basements. I can barely order coffee without stuttering. You deciphered a binding name. Do you understand what that means? Clearly not. She finally sat, but her usual perfect posture was gone. She looked exhausted, and somehow more real than she'd been in the lecture. 500 years ago, my house used binding names to control others. Speak the name correctly in the presence of certain protocols, and you could command anyone linked to that house. Entire populations were enslaved through linguistics and technology. Dan sank into his chair. That's horrifying. Yes, it is why the practice was abolished, why the names were sealed, Why, I've spent my entire career trying to ensure no record of them survived." She looked at him directly. "And then you walk in here with perfect phonetic reconstruction from a probe that shouldn't have contained that information at all. The probe was from your house? It must have been. An escape vessel from the Civil Wars, perhaps. Someone fleeing who carried the name with them."
She rubbed her temples, a gesture so human it startled him. "When you spoke it, you activated identification protocols. The old systems recognized the sound pattern. They now recognize you." "Recognize me as what?" "As someone who can potentially command anyone bound to my house, which, technically, includes me." The room felt very small suddenly. "But I don't want to command anyone."
"I just wanted to understand a linguistic pattern. I'm really sorry I found your family's nightmare fuel." Dan's hands were shaking again. "Can we just destroy the recording? Erase my notes? I'll forget the pronunciation. I'm good at forgetting things I'm nervous about." "It's not that simple. The moment you spoke it, the protocols activated, transmitted. Other people may now know that a human possesses the phonetic key." "What other people?" Before she could answer, someone knocked on the door. Arthur Kell didn't wait for a response before entering, his politician's smile firmly in place. "Dr. Areth?" "Dan? Sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Chen mentioned you were having a productive meeting about the Sonda project." Dan's stomach dropped. Dr. Chen knew about the meeting, which meant she'd probably mentioned it in their daily briefing, which meant Arthur knew, and Arthur always showed up when he smelled an opportunity. "Mr. Kell." Dr. Areth's voice had shifted back to formal neutrality, but Dan could hear the strain under it. "This is a private research consultation." Of course. Just wanted to check in. Any breakthroughs worth sharing?" His eyes landed on Dan's tablet, still displaying the symbol comparisons. "Nothing conclusive," Dan said quickly. Too quickly. Arthur's smile widened. "Really? Because Chen mentioned something about unusual network activity linked to the old probe. First transmission in what, 40 years? That sounds fairly conclusive to me." Dr. Areth stood, placing herself between Arthur and Dan's tablet. "Mr. Kell, I appreciate Earth's enthusiasm for discovery, but some research requires discretion." "Discretion? Right." Arthur's tone stayed friendly, but something predatory had entered his expression. "Or maybe some research requires diplomatic oversight, especially when it involves Tevalan historical artifacts and potential breakthroughs in interspecies communication." "It was just a linguistic analysis," Dan tried. "Nothing diplomatic about phonetic reconstruction." "Dan, you're brilliant with languages but terrible at politics. Let me translate for you." Arthur leaned against the doorframe. "If Earth has discovered something valuable to Tevalan culture, that's a diplomatic asset, one that could significantly improve our standing in the galactic community. Or," Dr. Areth said coldly, "it could be a cultural violation that damages relations irreparably." "Which is why we should discuss it. Officially. Tomorrow morning, perhaps? Full briefing with the council liaisons." Arthur's smile never wavered. "Unless there's a reason you'd prefer to keep this discovery private." Dan looked at Dr. Areth. Her face had returned to that controlled mask, but her hands were clenched at her sides. "There's no discovery," Dan said. "Just preliminary research that didn't pan out. Sorry to waste everyone's time." Arthur didn't look convinced. "Well, if that changes, my door's always open. Earth and Tevalan working together, that's what the Institute is all about." He nodded to both of them and left, but Dan had the sinking feeling he wasn't leaving the topic alone. The door closed. Silence stretched. "He knows something happened," Dan said quietly. "Yes." "And he's going to push until he finds out what." "Yes." Dan rubbed his face. "I really am sorry. I just wanted to solve a puzzle. I didn't mean to open whatever this is." Dr. Areth studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not the formal, pleasant expression from the lecture, but something genuine and tired. "You offered me chocolate yesterday, didn't you?" In the cafeteria line, when I was trying to understand human currency denominations. You remember that? You didn't laugh when I handed the vendor a transit pass instead of payment. You just quietly fixed it and gave me your spare coffee card. She shook her head. You are perhaps the least threatening person to have ever held this kind of power. I don't want power. I want to translate dead languages in peace. I know, that's why I'm going to trust you. She took a breath, and why we need to figure out what to do before Arthur Kell decides you're Earth's newest diplomatic weapon. They worked through the night, not in Research Room 7, which felt too exposed, but in Dan's basement laboratory where Athena could monitor for intrusions, and the coffee maker never stopped. Dr. Aerith had removed the formal jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and pulled her hair into a messier knot. Dan tried not to notice how the change made her seem less like an untouchable scholar and more like a person who also survived on caffeine and stubbornness. There, she said, pointing at a sequence in the Sonda recording. That phrase, after the name. Play it again. Dan queued it up. The audio was degraded, but with Athena's filters, he could make out words now. Dr. Aerith translated as it played, her voice soft. Whoever hears this name, know that we failed. We thought we could control the bonds of loyalty, but we only created chains. If you understand these words, please, do not repeat our mistake. Dan stopped the playback. This was a warning, a confession. She stared at the waveform display. Someone from my house, probably fleeing after the Civil War ended. They carried the name not to preserve it, but to bury it where no one would find it. Except I found it. Except you found it. She turned to look at him. And instead of using it, instead of testing what it could do, you came to me to ask what it meant. Well, yeah, you're the expert. Most humans, most people, when they discover power, their first instinct is to grasp it, to test its limits. You immediately sought to understand it. Something in her expression softened. That is not common in my experience. Dan felt heat rise in his cheeks and focused intently on his tablet. I just like solving puzzles. Power is terrifying, honestly. Good. Fear of power is often the beginning of wisdom. Athena interrupted. I hate to disturb this moment of interspecies bonding, but Arthur Kell just requested access to Dan's project files. Denied, Dan said immediately. He has authorization from Dr. Chen. Then Chen can ask me herself. Dr. Aerith stood. We need to present this our way before Arthur shapes the narrative. A controlled disclosure that frames it as historical warning, not diplomatic weapon. Will the Tevalan Council accept that? If I present it, perhaps. I have credibility in historical research. She paused. But they'll want to know who else can pronounce the name. Just me, right? Just you. Which makes you either a liability to be contained or an asset to be controlled, depending on who's deciding. Dan's anxiety spiked. I really don't like either of those options. Which is why we control the presentation. She pulled up a clean workspace on his holographic display. We write this together, a joint paper, Earth researcher and Tevalan scholar. We emphasize the warning, the historical tragedy, the importance of not repeating the past. They worked until dawn, crafting careful language that told the truth without revealing how completely Dan could reproduce the binding name. Dr. Chen approved the presentation to a closed council session. Arthur agreed, though his smile suggested he had his own plans. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. Around 3 a.m., when Dr. Aerith was deep in translation work and Dan was fighting exhaustion, he made the mistake of opening the cafeteria snacks he'd stashed in his desk drawer. What is that? She looked at the chocolate bar with scientific curiosity. Emergency calories? Want some? She took a piece, examined it with the same intensity she'd given the ancient recordings, then cautiously tasted it. The expression on her face was worth every hour of lost sleep. Your species, she said slowly, transforms bitter seeds into comfort food. We transform a lot of things, usually with sugar and questionable decisions. She laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite acknowledgement she'd given in public spaces, but a real sound that made her seem younger. I've spent 3 months on Earth, and that might be the most accurate description I've heard. Athena, note the exact moment Dr. Aerith approved of human civilization. Noted, Athena replied. Should I alert the press? No, but maybe get ready to answer questions about chocolate's cultural significance. I hate both of you, Athena said, in the tone that meant she absolutely didn't. They finished the presentation at dawn. It was good, thorough, diplomatic. It positioned the discovery as a cautionary tale about power and the importance of sealing dangerous knowledge. This might actually work, Dan said, reviewing their slides one last time. It has to work. The alternative is you becoming a diplomatic prisoner, and I'm rather against that outcome. You barely know me. I know you knelt when I did. I know you tried to apologize for discovering something you couldn't have known was forbidden. I know you're more interested in understanding than possessing. She met his eyes. That's more than I knew about most people I've worked with for years. The presentation went smoothly. Too smoothly. Dr. Chen seemed satisfied. The Tavalan Council representatives, joining by holo-conference, asked careful questions that Dr. Aerith answered with perfect academic precision. Then the senior counselor, an elderly Tavalan with ritual markings on his face, asked the question Dan had been dreading. This name that was discovered, who else has mastered its pronunciation? Only Mr. Moretti, Dr. Aerith said steadily. The phonetic complexity makes it difficult for most humans to reproduce accurately. But he can reproduce it? With enough precision to activate the ancient protocols? Silence. Arthur Kell leaned forward, smile bright. Yes, in fact, we have recordings for verification purposes. Dan's pronunciation is remarkably accurate. Dan's stomach dropped. What recordings? Oh, didn't Chen mention? Standard security protocols. All research sessions are logged. Arthur's smile widened, which means Earth now has documentation of the phonetic key to a historically significant Tavalan protocol. Quite the diplomatic asset, wouldn't you say? Dr. Aerith went very still. The senior counselor's expression hardened. Mr. Kell, are you suggesting Earth intends to leverage this knowledge? I'm suggesting we recognize the significance of what's been discovered. Dan here is the only human in history who can access this system. That makes him rather valuable to future Earth-Tavalan relations. Or, Dr. Aerith said coldly, it makes him a target for those who would misuse the old powers. Dan looked between them, realization sinking in. He'd been set up. The private meeting, the comfortable research room, probably even the security that had supposedly been breached. Arthur had been collecting evidence of his ability the whole time. Arthur caught him in the hallway after. Don't look so betrayed, this is good for you. Earth's newest diplomatic liaison. You'll get funding, recognition, actual office space above ground. I don't want any of that. What you want is irrelevant. What Earth needs is leverage in galactic politics. Congratulations, Dan. You just became important whether you like it or not. He walked away, leaving Dan standing in the corridor, feeling like the walls were closing in. Dr. Aerith found him 10 minutes later, still frozen in the same spot. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I should have anticipated this. It's not your fault. I'm the idiot who thought solving puzzles wouldn't have consequences. Dan slumped against the wall. What happens now? Now? Now we figure out how to keep you from becoming a weapon. Any ideas? She looked at him, golden eyes serious. One, but you're not going to like it. Dr. Aerith's idea was to meet privately with the Tavalan Council before Arthur could arrange an official Earth delegation. Dan agreed, mostly because all his other options were worse. The council meeting was scheduled for the following morning, but at 11 p.m. Dr. Chen knocked on Dan's door. Pack a bag, she said. Tevalan Council wants you in protective custody until they determine security protocols. Protective custody? That's just arrest with better PR. It's for your safety, and frankly, for political stability. Arthur's already leaked the story to 3 different news agencies. By morning, everyone will know a human can access ancient Tevalan systems. Dr. Chen looked genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry, Dan, I tried to contain this. You approved the recordings. I approve standard security protocols. I didn't know Arthur would weaponize them. She sighed. For what it's worth, I believe you, that you didn't mean any harm, but intention doesn't matter now. The information is out. Dan sat on his bed, feeling numb. When do they take me? Transport arrives in 2 hours. You'll be held at the Tevalan embassy until the council decides what to do with you. After she left, Dan just stared at his apartment walls. This was his nightmare scenario. Not just public speaking or presentations, but being the center of an interplanetary incident. Being important in a way he never wanted to be. Athena's voice came through his personal comm. I have a message from Dr. Aerith. Audio only, encrypted. Play it. Dr. Aerith's voice was quiet, urgent. Dan, before they take you, you need to understand what's really at stake. Meet me in the archives. Sublevel 4, restricted section. I'll clear your access. We have 1 hour. The archives were empty at midnight. Dr. Aerith was waiting by a sealed vault door, her usual composure completely gone. Thank you for coming. Chen said I have 2 hours before transport. Then we need to be fast. She pressed her palm to the security panel. The vault opened, revealing shelves of physical documents, the kind too sensitive to exist in digital form. She pulled out a folder marked with glyphs Dan recognized as pre-unification symbols. My house's name wasn't always Aerith, she said, spreading documents across a table. That came after. During the Civil War, we were called by the binding name, Arethanar, the chain holders. Dan looked at the documents, treaties, battle reports, population control records. His stomach turned as he understood the scope. How many? At our height, 60 million Tevalan were bound to my house, not through loyalty or choice, but through the name-binding technology. Speak the name with proper authority, and they had to obey. Any command, any order. Her hands shook as she turned pages, including orders to kill each other. Jesus. The Civil War ended when a coalition destroyed the name-binding infrastructure and sealed the knowledge. But some of my house escaped, renegades who never accepted the abolition, who've spent 5 centuries waiting for a chance to reclaim that power. Dan felt cold. The probe transmission. Yes, when you spoke the name and activated the old protocols, it sent a signal. I've been monitoring Tevalan communications. There are renegade groups who received it, who now know a human has the phonetic key. They're coming for me. They're already here. That's why the Council wants you in custody. Not to protect Earth, to protect themselves from what you could become if the renegades reach you first. I wouldn't help them. They wouldn't ask. They'd use chemical coercion or neural manipulation or any of a dozen other methods. You'd speak the name, thinking it was your choice, and millions would be enslaved again. She closed the folder. That's why I'm going to do something I swore I'd never do. She pulled out a small device, something like a medical scanner but older, covered in the same glyphs as the binding name. This is a severance key. It was used during the Civil War to free individuals from name binding. It removes someone's connection to their house permanently. Once severed, they can never be bound again. They also can never return home. They become houseless, which in Tevalan society means. She struggled for the word. Exile. Permanent. You want to use it on me? On myself. She met his eyes. If I sever my connection to my house, the name loses its power over me. You could speak it 1,000 times, and it would mean nothing. We'd have only trust between us. No ancient protocols, no chains. But you'd lose everything. I'd lose a heritage of shame and a title I never wanted. I'd keep my work, my research, my life. She smiled sadly. And I'd prove to the council that at least one person from my house chooses freedom over power. Lisa, you can't. Yes, I can. Watch. She placed the device against her temple. There was a sound like breaking glass in the frequency range just below human hearing. Dan felt it more than heard it, a wrongness in the air. Dr. Aerith gasped, dropped the device, and caught herself against the table. Blood trickled from her nose. Are you okay? I'm free. She wiped the blood away. Say it. Say the name. I'm not going to. Say it. We need to know if it worked. Dan took a breath and spoke the binding name. Arethanar. Nothing happened. No response from ancient protocols. No compulsion. Just a word, stripped of power. It worked, she said. You can't command me. The old systems don't recognize me anymore. I'm nobody's tool. You're not nobody. To my people's oldest laws I am. But to Earth, I'm still a scholar. To you, I'm still. She paused. What am I to you? Before Dan could answer, alarms blared through the institute. Security breach! Athena's voice echoed through the building. Unknown craft has penetrated atmospheric defenses. Incoming trajectory suggests hostile intent. All personnel to shelters. Dr. Aerith and Dan looked at each other. The renegades, she whispered. They're not waiting for the council to decide. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in red. They're coming for you, Dr. Aerith said. We need to get you to the transport. I don't want to be in custody. Better custody than what they'll do to you. They ran toward the main level, but the elevators were locked down. Stairs only, and Dan could hear sounds of fighting from above. Weapons fire. Screams. This way. Dr. Aerith pulled him toward a maintenance passage. There's an emergency exit that leads to... The wall exploded inward. 3 T-Valen in combat armor stood in the breach. The lead one, a woman with markings similar to Dr. Aerith's but darker, more intricate, smiled. Little cousin, she said in T-Valen, still running from your birthright. Sinara, you're supposed to be dead. Death is what they tell you when they want you to disappear. The renegade leader looked at Dan. And you must be the human, the one who found what was lost. You're coming with us. He's not going anywhere. Dr. Aerith positioned herself between them. You severed yourself. I can smell it on you. You have no authority here anymore. Sinara gestured, and her soldiers raised weapons. Step aside, or become collateral damage. Dr. Aerith didn't move. Dan realized, with perfect clarity, that she was willing to die for him. This woman he'd known for less than a week, who'd sacrificed her connection to her entire people to prove a point about trust. The soldiers advanced, and Dan made a choice. Dan stepped forward, around Dr. Aerith, hands raised in surrender. Okay, I'll go. Just don't hurt anyone. Dan, no! It's fine. He looked at Lisa, hoping she could see what he was trying to do. Buy time. Keep her alive. They want me, not you. Let's just get this over with. Sinara smiled. Smart human. We might not need the chemical persuasion after all. Sure, they hit him with a stunner anyway. Dan woke up in a cargo container that smelled like ozone and metal. His head throbbed. His hands were bound with something that felt like liquid but held like steel. The container opened. He was on a ship, small and fast, probably cloaked or they wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes near Earth. Sinara stood over him, flanked by her soldiers. Let's establish some ground rules, she said in English, her accent perfect. You are going to help us reactivate the binding protocols. You will speak the name at the correct time, in the correct ritual context. If you cooperate, this will be painless. And if I don't? Then we use methods that make cooperation irrelevant. Neural override, chemical coercion, biological manipulation. You'll speak the name believing it's your own idea. Less elegant, but effective. Dan's heart raced, that familiar anxiety climbing into panic territory. But underneath the fear was something else. Anger. At Arthur for weaponizing his discovery. At the situation for forcing choices on him. At himself for being naive enough to think research existed in a vacuum. "Why do you even want this?" he asked. "You lost the Civil War. Your people decided the binding was wrong. My people were cowards who chose comfortable submission over glorious purpose. The name binding wasn't oppression. It was order, unity, strength." Sonara crouched to his level. "Under the old house, we were feared, respected. Now we're just another voice in the council's endless debates. That's not living. That's existing. So you want to enslave millions of people because you're bored?" She hit him. Stars exploded across his vision. "I want to restore what was stolen, and you, human, are the key we've waited centuries for." She stood. "We'll begin the ritual in 3 hours. I suggest you use that time to make peace with your role in history." They locked him in a cell that was too small and too cold. Dan sat with his back against the wall, trying to control his breathing, trying not to spiral into the full panic attack he could feel building. This was it, the presentation that went wrong. The moment his voice destroyed everything. He'd failed his engineering group years ago by freezing during a presentation. Now he was going to fail an entire civilization by being forced to speak in a ritual he didn't understand. "I always ruin things," he whispered to the empty cell. Always. His tablet was gone. His glasses were gone. He was alone with his thoughts, which was the worst possible place to be. But then his tablet chimed. Wait, no. They'd taken that. The sound was coming from somewhere else. He found it wedged under the cell's bench. A spare tablet, older model, scratched and basic but functional. And on its screen, a message from Athena. "Dr. Aereth is alive, in medical but stable. She asked me to tell you. Your voice only has power if you choose to give it. They can force sounds, but not intention. The name requires both." Dan read it 3 times, the words slowly penetrating his panic. Intention. The ritual required intention, not just pronunciation. He'd activated the protocols because he wanted to understand. His curiosity had driven the connection. But if he spoke the name without wanting it to work, without investing intention in the words, "They can make me speak," he said quietly, "but they can't make me mean it." The cell door opened. Sonara stood there with 2 guards. "Time to fulfill your purpose, human." They brought him to what looked like a cargo bay converted into a ritual space. Ancient Tavalan symbols covered the floor in concentric circles. At the center, a platform with interface nodes that glowed with the same frequency he'd seen in the Sonda recording, the old binding technology, still functional after 5 centuries. "Stand there," Sonara directed him to the platform. "When I give the signal, you will speak the binding name 3 times. The systems will recognize the phonetic pattern, link to your voice signature, and grant us control over all T-Valens still carrying the genetic markers of the old house." How many? Millions, scattered across the galaxy. Most don't even know they carry the markers. But once activated, they'll hear our commands as divine mandate. We'll rebuild what was destroyed. Dan stepped onto the platform. His hands were still bound, but his voice was free. Sonara began the ritual in archaic Tavalan, words that made the air feel heavy. The interface nodes pulsed in response, ancient systems waking up after centuries of sleep. "Now," Sonara commanded, "speak the name." Dan opened his mouth and pronounced it wrong. Not obviously wrong, just off. The tonal frequencies slightly flat, the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Close enough to be recognizable, but not close enough to trigger the precise pattern recognition the old systems required. The interface nodes flickered, confused. "Again," Sonara snapped. "Correctly." "I'm trying," Dan said, putting every ounce of his natural anxiety into his voice. "It's hard, I told you. Human vocal cords don't do the tonal things right. I get nervous and stutter and—" "You pronounced it perfectly in the Institute recordings." "That took me like 50 tries, and I wasn't being held hostage. Stress makes it worse. I start gagation. Gagesha." He deliberately stumbled over the word. "Stuttering, see?" Sinara stared at him. "You're sabotaging this." "I'm anxious. This is literally my nightmare scenario. Public speaking, except alien ritual edition." "Neural override," she ordered her soldiers. "Now." They moved toward him with a device that looked like it would hurt. Dan started talking faster, filling the air with nervous babble. "Wait, okay, I'll try again. Just give me a second. Deep breath. Like my therapist taught me. Except I can't remember what she taught me because I'm terrible at remembering things when people point weapons at me and—" The ship shuddered. Alarms blared. "We're under attack," a renegade reported. "Tevalan Council ships, Earth fighters, they found us." "It doesn't matter. Complete the ritual." Sinara grabbed Dan by the collar. "Say the name." He looked her in the eyes, found the core of stubborn defiance he'd been sitting on his whole life, and smiled. "No." She struck him. He tasted blood. The ship shook again, harder this time. Systems sparked. "You'll die here," she hissed. "Was defiance worth your life?" "Is control worth millions of lives?" Dan shot back. "Because I did the math. I'll take one death over a million enslaved." Another explosion. The ritual chamber's wall cracked. Through the breach, Dan could see fighters engaged in combat, and on the lead Earth ship, a familiar silhouette at the con station, Dr. Aerith, piloting. Which shouldn't have been possible because she was supposed to be in medical, and also scholars didn't normally pilot military craft. The ship lurched violently. The ritual platform destabilized. The ancient interface nodes began to overload, 500 years of dormant power surging through systems that couldn't handle it. "Everyone off the ship," a new voice called over comms. It was Arthur Kell, and he sounded legitimately worried. "Core's going critical. 30 seconds. Sinara looked between Dan and her destabilizing ritual. Realization crossed her face. She'd lost. The platform was collapsing. The name was unspoken, and the humans had somehow rallied faster than any renegade war plan had anticipated. "This isn't over," she told Dan. "Yeah, it is," Dan replied. "Your ritual needed intention. I chose not to give it. Power ends where choice begins." 20 seconds. The ritual chamber was filling with smoke. Sinara and her soldiers retreated to escape pods. Dan stood on the platform, hands still bound, surrounded by exploding ancient technology. The wall blew inward completely. Dr. Aerith, in a borrowed EVA suit, grabbed him and pulled him toward the breach. "Hold on," she said. They jumped into space. 3 days later, Dan woke up in a medical bay that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Better than the cargo container. Marginally. Dr. Aerith sat in a chair beside his bed, reading something on a data pad. She'd traded the formal scholar attire for simple clothes, and her hair was pulled back in a practical braid. She looked exhausted and relieved in equal measure. "You piloted a military ship," Dan said. His voice came out rough. "I have many skills not listed on my academic resume." She set the data pad aside. "How do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a politician's ambition and a renegade's ritual. So, about normal for the week." He tried to sit up, regretted it, and settled for a slightly less horizontal position. "What happened after the jump?" "Arthur's team recovered us. The renegade ship exploded as predicted. Sinara and her core group escaped, but their ritual infrastructure is destroyed." She paused. "The Tevalan Council watched recordings of your sabotage. They were impressed. Impressed that I can't pronounce things correctly. Impressed that you chose not to, that when given the opportunity to speak a word that would have saved your life, you refused because speaking it would have enslaved others." She smiled. The council elder said something I've never heard him say before. He said, "The human chose failure, deliberately, as if success in evil were worse than death in defiance." Then he laughed for 5 minutes straight. I'm glad my anxiety-induced sabotage was entertaining. It was revolutionary. In 5 centuries, everyone who found the name either used it or was forced to use it. You're the first person to find it, gain the ability to use it, face coercion to use it, and still refuse. She leaned forward. "Dan, do you understand what that means to my people? To see someone value freedom over power? I didn't value freedom. I was terrified and stubborn." "Exactly. You were afraid and you still chose correctly. That's not weakness. That's courage." Athena's voice came through the medical bay speakers. "I hate to interrupt this tender moment, but there's a delegation here to see Dan. And by delegation, I mean everyone." "Everyone?" The door opened. Dr. Chen entered, followed by Arthur Kell, 3 T-Valen Council members via hollow projection, and Dr. Aref's assistant, who Dan had never actually met but who apparently existed. "This is too many people," Dan said weakly. "Agreed," said the senior T-Valen counselor. "But necessary. We have a proposal. Multiple proposals, actually from different factions. We thought it fair to present them all at once and let you choose." Arthur stepped forward first. "Earth wants to offer you a position in our diplomatic corps. Full funding, security, the works. What you did, refusing that power, it made Earth look principled. We could use that." "You mean use me?" "I mean recognize your value. I was wrong before, trying to leverage your discovery." "I see that now." Arthur actually looked sincere. "But you do have value, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. Someone who chose humanity over power. That's rare." One of the T-Valen counselors spoke next. "The T-Valen Council wishes to offer you guardianship of the historical records related to the binding name. You would work with Dr. Areth to ensure the knowledge is preserved as warning, not weapon." "Why me?" "Because you're the only person in recorded history who had the power and refused it. That makes you trustworthy in ways that credentials never could." Dr. Chen cleared her throat. "Or, third option, you could just go back to your basement and keep translating dead languages. I can make sure everyone leaves you alone. It's not glamorous, but it's safe." Dan looked at each of them, then at Dr. Areth. "What do you think?" "I think," she said carefully, "that you've earned the right to choose without input. But if you're asking what I want to keep working with you. The guardianship option means we'd be partners, co-researchers, making sure history doesn't repeat. Would I have to give presentations? Probably some. In front of people? That is generally how presentations work. Hard pass." The counselor who'd been silent spoke up. "What if we provided support? Someone to handle the public aspects while you handle the research?" Dr. Areth raised her hand. "I volunteer." "You just severed yourself from your house," another counselor objected. "You're not technically T-Valen anymore in the legal sense." "No, I'm not. I'm houseless, which means I have no political allegiance to any faction. I can present the research without suspicion of bias." She looked at the counselor directly. "And I understand better than anyone what the binding name can do. I lived with that heritage my entire life." "It would be unprecedented." "Good. Precedents are how things change." Dan felt something shift in the room. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Dr. Areth, too. About both of them proving that the old ways didn't have to define the future. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it. The guardianship thing. But only if she's actually my partner, not my handler. Equal authority. Equal say." The counselors conferred briefly. "Agreed. Dr. Areth, you'll be restored to scholar status with guardianship rights. Dan Moretti, you'll be granted the same." "One more condition," Dan added. "Athena gets credit too. She's been essential to all of this. If she's not recognized as part of the research team, I'm out." Athena's voice actually cracked slightly. "That is unexpected. You're not a tool, you're a colleague. About time someone said it officially." The counselors looked confused, but Dr. Chen smiled. "Noted. Athena will be listed as collaborative researcher on all publications." After everyone left, it was just Dan and Dr. Aerith again. "Partners," she said, testing the word. "If that's okay. I know you're used to working alone and being elegant and not dealing with anxious humans who can barely function at staff meetings. Dan, you sabotaged an ancient ritual through strategic incompetence while facing execution. I think you'll manage staff meetings." "Those aren't the same thing at all." "No, but they require the same skill, knowing when to speak and when to pretend you can't." She stood to leave, then paused. "The name still exists in the recording, in your memory. If you wanted to, you could still use it. But I won't." "I know. That's why we're partners." She smiled. "See you tomorrow. We have history to rewrite." After she left, Dan lay in the medical bed staring at the ceiling. "Athena?" "Yes. So did I just accidentally become important?" "Worse, you became symbolic. People will write papers about you, bad papers, with questionable metaphors. Can we go back to the basement? Eventually. But first you have to change galactic politics through the power of refusing to speak. No pressure." Dan groaned. But under the anxiety, under the exhaustion, there was something else, something that felt almost like hope. He'd found a word that could enslave millions, and he'd chosen not to speak it. That had to count for something. The ceremony was supposed to be simple, a formal acknowledgement of guardianship. Dan and Dr. Aerith would take their oaths, receive their official authority over the historical records, and everyone could go back to their normal lives. Instead, Sinara crashed it. The Institute's main auditorium was full when the attack began. Council members, Earth diplomats, researchers, press from a dozen worlds. Dan was halfway through his extremely uncomfortable prepared speech when the windows exploded inward. Renegade fighters dropped through the breach, weapons raised. Sinara descended last, suspended on a grav harness, looking like vengeance in armor. "I told you this wasn't over," she called out. "You destroyed one ritual site. We have others." Security forces engaged immediately. The auditorium erupted into chaos. Dan dove behind the podium, his speech notes scattering. Dr. Aerith pulled him toward an emergency exit. "We need to get you out of here." "They want me," Dan realized. "If I run, they'll chase me. People will die. If you stay, they'll capture you and force the ritual." Arthur Kell, for once, was actually useful. He rallied security forces and Earth response teams with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning for exactly this scenario, which, knowing Arthur, he probably had. "Get Dan to the vault," he ordered Dr. Chen. "Seal it. Don't open for anyone but me or Council authority." They ran, Dan, Dr. Aerith, Dr. Chen, and a security detail that kept shrinking as renegades picked them off. They made it to the archives, to the vault, where Dr. Aerith had shown Dan the truth about her house. The vault sealed behind them, thick walls, independent life support. They could hold out for hours. "Athena," Dan called. "Status. Renegades control the upper 3 levels. Tevalan Council forces are en route but won't arrive for 20 minutes. Earth military is engaged but outmatched. The renegades brought better technology." "Can they break through the vault door?" "Given enough time, yes." Dr. Aerith pulled up schematics on the vault's terminal. "There's another option. The old binding technology. It wasn't just in their ritual chamber. There's an installation here, in the Institute. That's why they chose this location." "Where?" "Sublevel 7, the same level as the crashed probe. They've been rebuilding the infrastructure in secret, probably for months." Dan felt cold. "So if they can't take me to a ritual site, they bring the ritual site to me." "Yes? Then we destroy it," Dr. Chen said. "Can't complete a ritual without the technology." The installation is shielded. Only someone with guardianship authority can access it. Dr. Aerith looked at Dan. Which, as of 10 minutes ago, includes us. There's got to be another way. There isn't. We need to destroy the binding technology permanently, and we need to do it before they breach this vault. Athena interrupted.
I'm detecting power fluctuations in sublevel 7. They're activating something. Dr. Aerith pulled up the feed. On-screen renegades were indeed powering up a ritual installation that looked exactly like the one from the ship. And at its center, a recording device. They're going to use your voice, Dr. Aerith realized. The recordings Arthur made. They'll play them through the system.
It's not perfect, but with enough power and the right modifications, it might be enough to trigger partial activation. How partial? Millions instead of tens of millions. Still catastrophic. Dan made a decision. The kind his therapist would have told him to reconsider. The kind that terrified him but felt right anyway. We go to sublevel 7, destroy the installation, then figure out how to stop them from ever rebuilding it. That's suicide, Dr. Chen protested. They'll be waiting. They'll be waiting outside the vault too. At least this way, we choose the battlefield. The emergency passages that connected the archives to sublevel 7 were cramped and dark. Dan's anxiety screamed at him the entire way. This was every nightmare scenario combined. Danger. People depending on him. The absolute certainty that he was going to mess this up. But Dr. Aerith was beside him, and that helped. Her presence, solid and real, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. They emerged in the probe's storage area. The ritual installation was at the far end, surrounded by renegades and humming with power. And there, in the center, a holographic projection of Dan's voice patterns ready to be weaponized. "We need a distraction," Dr. Aerith whispered. "I have an idea." Dan stood up before he could talk himself out of it. "Hey, you want me to speak the name? I'm right here." Every weapon swung toward him. Sinara smiled from her position by the ritual controls. "Convenient. We were going to use your recordings, but having you here in person? Even better." She gestured. "Bring him." Dan walked forward, hands raised. Dr. Aerith moved in the shadows behind the equipment. Dr. Chen signaled security teams through her comm. "You sabotaged us once," Sinara said. "You won't get the chance again. We've modified the ritual. It requires only phonetic approximation now, not exact pronunciation, and we have pharmaceutical encouragement." She pulled out an injector. "This will make you very cooperative." "Before you do that," Dan said, "I have a question. Why do you want this so badly?" "I told you. Order, unity, purpose." "No, I mean really. What do you get from enslaving people? What's the point?" Sinara paused. "The point is not being forgotten, not being erased. My house shaped the galaxy once. Now we're a footnote in history texts. This is about reclaiming what we were. You were slavers. We were powerful. Those aren't the same thing. To you, perhaps, but you're human. You don't understand what it's like to come from greatness and fall into mediocrity. To know your ancestors shaped worlds while you fill out council forms." Dan thought about that. "You're right. I don't understand that, but I do understand feeling powerless. Feeling like you don't matter. Like you're just the nervous guy in the basement while important people make important decisions. Then you should understand why we want this back. I understand the feeling. I don't understand the solution." Dan glanced at the ritual installation. "You want to matter so badly that you'll make millions of people not matter at all? That's not power. That's fear. Philosophy won't save you." "No, but it might save you. Because here's the thing about the binding name. It doesn't just enslave the people bound to your house. It enslaves you too. You'll spend the rest of your life maintaining control, fighting rebellions, never trusting anyone. Is that really better than mediocrity?" For just a moment Sinara hesitated. Dan saw it, a flicker of doubt. Then the moment passed. "Enough. Administer the drug." Dr. Aerith emerged from behind the equipment. Or we could do this instead. She held a disruptor charge, the kind that would fry every electronic system in a 50-foot radius, including the ritual installation, and probably everything else in the room. That will kill us all, Sinara said. I know, and I'm okay with that if it means this technology dies too. Dr. Aerith looked at Dan. But I'd prefer a third option. Dan understood. The severance key. You used it on yourself. Could it work on the technology? Theoretically. The binding system works by linking genetic markers to command protocols. If we sever that connection, the technology becomes useless. It can activate all at once, but there's nothing to bind to. Exactly, Sinara laughed. The severance keys were all destroyed. We made sure of it. You destroyed all the physical keys, but the principle behind them? That's in the same forbidden archives where I found the history of my house. Dr. Aerith connected her datapad to the ritual installation. Athena, are you seeing this? Receiving. Give me 30 seconds to adapt the code. We don't have 30 seconds. Sinara lunged forward. Dan did something he'd never done in his life. He tackled someone. It was clumsy and probably looked ridiculous, but it got Sinara off balance long enough for Dr. Chen and her security team to burst in. The auditorium descended into controlled chaos, renegades fighting security, Dr. Aerith working frantically at the terminal. Athena counting down. 20 seconds. 15. 10. Stop her! Sinara broke free from Dan and charged toward Dr. Aerith. Dan threw himself between them. Sinara's blade caught him across the ribs. Pain exploded, white and sharp. 5 seconds, Athena announced. Dr. Aerith slammed her hand on the execute command. The ritual installation screamed, not physically, but in frequencies that made teeth ache and eyes water. Every genetic marker that had ever been linked to the binding system suddenly wasn't. The connections severed, the chains broken. Across the galaxy, millions of Tivalan felt something they'd carried their whole lives simply disappear. A weight they hadn't known existed, suddenly gone. The installation shut down. Dead. Inert. Just metal and circuits with nothing to control. Sinara stared at it. No, this can't. It's over, Dr. Aerith said quietly. The binding name still exists, but there's nothing left for it to bind. You wanted to reclaim your power. We just made sure that power can never exist again. Sinara collapsed to her knees, not in surrender, but in the realization that she'd spent 5 centuries planning for something that was now permanently impossible. Dan, bleeding but conscious, looked at Dr. Aerith. Did we just free an entire genetic line? We did. Cool. Can someone call medical? I think I'm bleeding on historical documents. The last thing he saw before passing out was Dr. Aerith's face, smiling despite the chaos, looking more free than he'd ever seen her. 6 months later, Dan stood in his basement laboratory, which looked exactly the same except for 2 new additions. A second desk, which Dr. Aerith had claimed with the efficiency of someone who'd always belonged there, and a small plaque that read, Athena 9, Collaborative Researcher, which made the AI produce satisfied humming sounds at random intervals. I still don't understand why you prefer working down here, Dr. Aerith said, reviewing their latest paper on the historical significance of the binding technology. We have a proper office, with windows. Windows mean people can see in. This is perfect. It's a basement. It's my basement. She smiled, that genuine expression she'd developed over the past months. The formal mask of the scholar had given way to something more comfortable. She wore her hair loose now, traded formal attire for practical clothes, and had started keeping a stash of chocolate in her desk drawer. Fair enough, but you do realize we have a presentation next week at the Galactic Historical Conference? Dan groaned. Can't we just submit the paper and hide? We're the primary researchers. Hiding would be conspicuous. I'm good at conspicuous hiding. That's an oxymoron. It's a survival strategy, Athena interrupted. Reminder, Arthur Kell is here for your scheduled meeting. Dan had started doing regular consultations with Earth's diplomatic corps, not as a diplomat himself, which would have been his personal hell, but as an advisor on linguistic and cultural issues. Arthur had apologized properly and publicly for trying to weaponize Dan's discovery. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it was a start. "Send him down," Dan said. Arthur entered carrying coffee. "I brought tribute. Figured you two live on caffeine and stubbornness." "You're learning," Dr. Aerith accepted the cup. "How's the new treaty language looking?" Arthur asked, pulling up his datapad. "The Council wants to formalize the prohibition on genetic binding technology across all member species." Dan pulled up their draft. "We're using your discovery of the binding system and its destruction as case study, demonstrating why some knowledge needs to be preserved but not practiced." "There's opposition," Arthur warned. "Some species see this as precedent for banning research into other dangerous fields. They're worried about scientific censorship." "It's not censorship," Dr. Aerith said. "We're not hiding the knowledge. We're being honest about what it does and why it shouldn't be repeated. There's a difference between secrecy and responsibility." "That's the argument we're making too, but it'll be an uphill battle." Arthur looked at Dan. "You sure you don't want a public role in this? Your story carries weight. The human who refused power, who chose freedom over control. That resonates." "My story is that I got anxious, stumbled into something horrifying, and made the least terrible choice available. I'm not a symbol. I'm a translator who got lucky." "You're whatever people need you to be. That's how symbols work." "Then people need to find better symbols." Dr. Chen appeared at the door, knocking even though it was open. "Am I interrupting?" "Always. But we forgive you," Dan said. "What's up?" "Just wanted to check on you two. Make sure you're actually working and not just arguing about coffee." "We can do both simultaneously," Dr. Aerith assured her. "It's called multitasking." "It's called procrastination," Athena corrected. "Your paper is due in 3 days and you've spent the last hour debating the Oxford comma. The Oxford comma is important. It's a punctuation mark, not a moral stance." Dr. Chen laughed. "I see things are normal here." "Good, because I have news. The Council approved your proposal for the Memorial Archive." Dan and Dr. Aerith exchanged glances. They'd been working on this for months. A permanent archive dedicated to documenting and studying the binding technology, not as blueprint, but as warning. A place where the full history was preserved, the good and the terrible, so future generations wouldn't forget what happened when power became more important than people. "They're giving us full authority over it," Dr. Chen continued. "Design, staffing, access protocols. It's unprecedented for a joint human-to-Valen project to have this much autonomy." "They're trusting us because we proved we won't abuse it," Dr. Aerith said quietly. "Exactly. You two set a new precedent. Guardianship based on demonstrated character rather than institutional authority." Dr. Chen smiled. "Congratulations. You're now responsible for one of the most important historical resources in the galaxy. No pressure." After she left, Dan slumped in his chair. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone who still gets nervous ordering sandwiches. You faced down a renegade army. I think you can handle sandwich orders." "Those aren't remotely the same thing. They require similar skills. Knowing what you want and refusing to be bullied into accepting less." "That's a terrible metaphor." "It's your metaphor. I'm just expanding on it." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only happens between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. Eventually, Dr. Aerith spoke. "Do you ever regret it? Finding the name?" "Sometimes. When I can't sleep and I think about everything that went wrong." Dan turned to look at her. "But then I think about what would have happened if I hadn't found it." If the renegades had gotten to it first, if there had been no one to say no when it mattered. You still have nightmares. I hear you sometimes when I'm working late. He flushed. Sorry, I know it's weird that I still work here at 3 a.m. It's not weird. It's processing. You went through trauma. These things take time. She paused. I have them too. The nightmares, about being back in my house, bound by the name, powerless. But you severed yourself. You're free. I know, but the fear lingers. That's what trauma does. It leaves echoes. She smiled sadly. We're quite the pair. The anxious human and the severed Tivalan, trying to prevent horrors we barely survived. Could be worse. We could be doing this alone. Yes, we could. Another silence. This one felt different, weighted with things neither of them quite knew how to say. The first time I said the binding name, Dan said quietly, you fell to your knees. You thought the past had won. I did. What changed? You knelt too. You saw me at my most vulnerable and chose to meet me there instead of standing over me. Dr. Aerith looked at him directly. That's when I knew. This human, this nervous translator who could barely introduce himself, he was going to change everything. I didn't change anything. I just refused to make things worse. Sometimes that's the same thing. The moment stretched. Dan felt like he should say something profound, something worthy of the weight between them. But words had never been his strength, at least not the spoken kind. So instead, he just reached across the space between their desks and offered his hand. Dr. Aerith took it. You know what word I like better than Arathanar? Dan asked. What? Choice. In any language, choice is better. She thought about that. Then carefully she pronounced the English word with her Tivalan accent. Choice. Perfect pronunciation. I have a good teacher. Athena, if you're recording this as cute moment for future researchers, I'm deleting your coffee preferences. I don't drink coffee. I'm an AI. You know what I mean. I do. And yes, I'm recording. This is historically significant. The moment two guardians decided that trust mattered more than power. Athena paused. Also, it's objectively adorable and I enjoy tormenting you. Dr. Aerith laughed. Actually laughed, the sound bright and free in the basement laboratory. Come on, she said, standing and pulling Dan up with her. Let's get lunch. Something that doesn't come from your emergency chocolate drawer. That drawer is strategically important. It's diabetes waiting to happen. Says the person who ate 17 pieces yesterday. I was researching human cultural practices. Sure you were. They walked toward the elevator, still holding hands, still arguing about nothing important. Behind them, the laboratory hummed with servers cataloging the history of a power that had been broken, preserved not as weapon but as warning. The binding name still existed. In recordings, in documents, in Dan's memory. But it couldn't bind anyone anymore. The chains were broken, the systems severed, the genetic links erased. All that remained was the choice to remember without repeating, to study without practicing, to preserve the past while refusing to become prisoners to it. And in a basement laboratory in Chicago, two people who'd accidentally changed the galaxy went to get sandwiches, because saving civilizations was hungry work, and some choices were beautifully, wonderfully simple. The name had been spoken, the power had been refused, and in that refusal, something better had begun. Not conquest, not control, not chains, just choice, always choice. And that, Dan thought as they emerged into the sunlight by Lake Michigan, was pretty fucking yeah for a species that started out just trying to understand a recording. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't violence or technology or political maneuvering. It was the stubborn, terrifying, beautiful decision to care more about others' freedom than their own power, even when it cost everything. Especially then, the galaxies would remember, not the human who could speak the name, but the human who chose not to, and the Tivalan scholar who chose trust over heritage. Together they'd rewritten what power meant, one word at a time, In the end, Dan didn't save the galaxy because he was brave, or brilliant, or destined. He saved it because when the universe handed him a word that could break millions, he simply refused to become the kind of person who would speak it. Sometimes humanity's greatest strength is exactly that. We trip over power, panic at responsibility, and somehow choose decency anyway. And maybe that's the quiet truth this story leaves behind, that freedom endures not because of grand heroes, but because of ordinary people who say no at the precise moment the universe expects them to say yes. So now I want to ask you, if you were handed a power you never wanted, what would stop you from using it? What does strength actually mean when no one is watching? And in a world obsessed with control, what part of yourself would you refuse to compromise, even if it cost everything? If you stayed with us until this final moment, write choice in the comments, because that's the word this entire story was secretly about. Tell me your city, so I know where across the stars this community is watching from. And if this story made you smile, think, or emotionally malfunction just a little, subscribe, like, hype it up, share with someone who needs a reminder that we're all stumbling toward goodness, and watch the next video on the final card now appearing on your screen. After all, stories only end when we stop choosing to tell them.